everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today we're going to be reviewing the newest album from Logic, No Pressure. Honestly, I wasn't anticipating on reviewing whatever new album Logic would eventually drop after the disaster that was last year's back-to-back release of Supermarket and Confessions of a Dangerous Mind, because both of those records, in my opinion, were pretty terrible. They were very much bad records in my opinion, as well as in the opinions of many other people too. And even before the release of those two albums last year, Logic's output during 2017 and 2018 was also pretty mediocre too. Not outright bad, just very bland for the most part. So I wasn't really expecting too much from him after those last couple of releases. However, when it came to the release of this album here, it's now been revealed that this is supposed to be his final studio album, that he's retiring from hip-hop after this, which I know I've seen plenty of people discuss online already about whether or not that's actually going to happen, because there's plenty of artists out there that say they're going to retire, but then they come back in a few years or something like that. But for the sake of convenience here in this review, I'm just going to assume that he is in fact going to retire for good, just to make things easier. So yeah, this was supposed to be his last studio album, and I figured after going through all the albums of his that I've gone through already, I might as well finish things up here with this last release. And I'm quite happy that I did, actually, because No Pressure is not only a good album in my opinion, but also one of the best releases from Logic so far. I mean, I don't think this is a great record, not one of the best of the year necessarily or anything like that, and I'm not quite sure I would say it's his best overall or anything, but I do think it's a really nice return to form for him, and it's definitely a big improvement over the two albums he put out last year. The sound and style on this record could probably best be described as Logic returning to his roots in a sense, this record being inspired pretty heavily by his first full-length studio album, Under Pressure. I mean, the titles of the records kind of suggest that, but the sound of this record too, and a lot of the stuff that Logic brings up here on this project to some extent does reference things on that album as well. The sound here on this project is one that sees Logic kind of returning to that sort of old boom-bappy style of production with a bit more of a modern twist to it. No ID is doing most of the production here on this thing. And in addition to that sound, there's also a bit of a soulful edge added to some of these tracks too, which I think is really nice. Overall, the production here on this record is pretty solid in my opinion. I do think that there are a few tracks here or there that maybe aren't quite as interesting as others when it comes to their production, but for the most part, the beats here on this thing are pretty nice sounding. Logic's rapping here on this album is also pretty solid. I've always thought of him as being a good rapper, but oftentimes, especially on some of his more recent works, he's kind of gotten into the pattern of just rapping quickly for the sake of rapping quickly, and I feel like that's kind of brought down the quality of his work to some extent. But here on this record, he still manages to sound, technical. He sounds like a good rapper here, but he avoids rapping, super quickly a ton here on this thing just for the sake of doing it, and most of his flows here sound better as a result of it. A lot of the flows here sound pretty natural, they sound really nice, and the few moments on this thing where he does decide to rap a bit more quickly, I think it works in adding a bit more flavor to the sound of this record just because he uses it as sparingly as he does. And when it comes to the hooks here on this record, they're also for the most part pretty enjoyable too, whether they're being performed by Logic or any of the other featured guests who come on this thing to occasionally do a hook or something. I think most of the hooks here are pretty memorable, pretty catchy. None of them are particularly bad or anything. There are maybe a few here or there that aren't as memorable as others, but compared to some of the hooks that were on some of his previous works, which I just didn't like at all, I think that this is a pretty solid collection of good hooks. The part of this record that I really enjoyed the most, though, is probably some of Logic's lyrics here on this project, especially because I feel like he does a good job at covering a good amount of subject matter here, but he's able to tie it together in a way that I think helps make this album feel somewhat cohesive. On this project, he's talking about his retirement, this being his last album and all of that. He's talking about his newborn child and how that kind of plays into things as well. He talks a bit about his mental health here on this project too. He also has a bit of fun here on this project. He's talking about his old works. He's referencing them throughout this project too, kind of looking back on the past and reminiscing. He talks about his come up at several points on this thing as well. Lots of stuff that, some of it he has talked about before, some of it he hasn't talked about before. But like I said before, I think he does a good job at taking all of these topics and kind of tying them together in a sort of cohesive manner. For example, he'll be talking about this being, like I said before, his last album, and he'll be talking about all of that stuff. But at the same time, he'll be talking about his child and how he wants to focus on his child more. though at the same time he'll be talking about his come up at certain points here on this project and some of the struggles that he faced earlier on in his life. And then at certain other points on this project he'll talk about his child again, especially on a track like Dad Bod, for example, where she's talking about raising his child probably in the most detail out of any of the tracks on this project. And while the song does kind of have this maybe sort of playful, silly edge to it at certain points, I think when you take into account some of the moments on this project where Logic's talking about his own upbringing and some of the struggles that he faced, I think it kind of paints this track in a bit of a different light. It kind of shows Logic trying to give his child a better, childhood and life, more generally speaking, when compared to what Logic himself had. And I think that's just a pretty good and kind of cool idea. Sure, Logic's talk about being a dad and all that stuff may seem, like I said before, maybe a bit humorous in certain regards, but I think the way it's framed here on this project, it's obvious that he cares a lot for his kid and he's just trying to, be the best that he can for that child. And then you also have Logic bringing up certain topics here on this record that deal more with current social and political issues, things like racial inequality and police brutality, stuff like that. And of course, it may just seem like stuff that's relevant to today's world because, it is. But at the same time, when you take into account some of the stuff he says about on this record about his child and how much focus he puts into that, I have to wonder if the reason why he's talking about this stuff isn't just because it's real world stuff that's happening right now, but because it's also stuff that, his child is going to have to face in the future as well. Even Logic's talk of mental health here on this project is a lot better in my opinion than some of the stuff he was saying on his previous releases, because while mental health is something he's talked about before, I always felt like on previous releases that his statements on the subject have been, maybe a bit too vague for their own good, or a bit insensitive at times, maybe a bit misinformed as well. But here on this project, I think he's able to make it work, mostly because he kind of simplifies it a bit and keeps his talk of mental health strictly tied to himself. Here on this project, he's talking about his own mental health and how social media was bad for his own health, and that's why he stepped away from it mostly. And, that's basically the core idea behind his last album, but I feel like the presentation of it here on this project is a lot better just because it feels a bit more focused on himself. He's mostly talking from his own experiences rather than trying to make, these big sweeping claims about social media and mental health and things like that. It's strictly focused on himself. And, hearing him talk about choosing to step away from social media and being happier as a result of that, and, pouring that time and effort into, his last album here, and his family, his child, and what he's going to be doing in the future, and how much happier he sounds here on this record as a result. It's kind of happy. I'm pretty happy to see that be the case, especially after hearing those last few releases from him. So overall, I think Logic does a much better job at tackling the issues of mental health here on this project compared to any of his previous releases, mostly just because, like I said before, he sticks to himself here on this project, and given that this record is, supposed to be a send-off record for him, kind of looking back on the past and himself, I think it works all for the better, honestly. And again, I really like the kind of silver lining aspect to it here on this record, where it seems like, he's talking about these very dark issues that he's dealt with over the years, but at the same time, it seems like there's a brighter future for him that, it's already very much in sight for him. Despite some of the subject matter on this record being pretty dark, there is also a good amount of happy moments on this project too, especially when it comes to Logic, kind of reminiscing about his past, talking about his previous records, and looking back on his success. I feel like, for a send-off record, that makes plenty of sense, and I think some of his rapping and lyrics in that regard is performed, pretty decently enough. Overall, those are a lot of the things on this record that I quite enjoyed, though I do have some problems with this record that I do want to discuss. Nothing that really makes this album outright bad or unlistenable, just a few little problems here or there across this thing. Some of the lyrics here on this project aren't the most interesting at times. Some of the bars here maybe feel a little filler-like at certain points, and I do feel like there are maybe a few tracks here or there in the track listing that could be cut to make this thing just a bit more concise and to the point. Additionally, I don't really find the narration that popped up between various tracks here on this thing to be all that necessary or interesting. I know it's something that Logic's done before on previous releases of his, and that's why he's kind of brought it back here on this one as well. However, after a few listens of this record, I just kind of found it to be a little bit annoying coming between some of the tracks here on this thing. Again, I don't really think it adds a ton to the record overall, and I feel like it could be cut while keeping much of what makes this record good. And I also feel like there are certain moments on this project where Logic decides to use some samples or just speeches and things like that that don't really need to be there. Like on the latter half of the track Dark Place, I feel like the first part of the track with Logic rapping is probably one of the best moments on the record because of the lyrics that I mentioned before, but the second half is noticeably weaker in my opinion just because the speech that's kind of implanted into the track just doesn't really add that much to it. I mean, it certainly fits in with the rest of the track, but I would have much preferred Logic just kept rapping the way that he was earlier on in the song and maybe just took the subject matter of that speech and made it his own. And then you have the whole final track on this record, Obediently Yours, which is pretty much just an Orson Welles speech just kind of planted at the very end of this record. And the subject matter of this speech is pretty good. I think it fits in with some of the stuff Logic was talking about earlier on the record, especially with some real world issues regarding race and things like that. I think the subject matter here is really good. It's just that it's not the most interesting way to end off this project because, like I said before, it's pretty much just a speech dropped at the very end of this thing. I would have much preferred if Logic just took the subject matter of this speech and kind of morphed it into his own track, which actually had him rapping on it and talking about this stuff himself. Either that or just completely cut this track out of the end of the record, because I feel like the track that comes before this one is a pretty solid end to the record. As it is, I kind of feel like this whole last track is maybe a little bit unnecessary. And maybe I'd be a bit more forgiving of it if this last track here wasn't like 6 or so minutes in length and just the longest track on this thing overall. It's a pretty lengthy listen for just being pretty much like a speech. And, you know, like I said before, the contents of the speech themselves are pretty interesting. They fit in with the rest of the record just fine. And listening through it the first time is, you know, fairly entertaining, I guess. But it's just on every repeated listen, I kind of felt like this last track didn't really need to be there. These issues, though, aren't necessarily the biggest problems in the world to have with your record or anything like that, and especially when compared to projects like Confessions of a Dangerous Mind or Supermarket, for example. No Pressure is a significant improvement for Logic when it comes to the quality of his releases. And I'm just pretty happy that this record ended up being as good as it is, honestly. Like I said before, I wasn't really expecting that much more quality out of Logic after those last couple of releases. So the fact that he completely turned it around and made one of his strongest projects to date so far here with No Pressure, I'm quite impressed, honestly. And I'm just happy that the record itself is thoroughly enjoyable to listen to, you know, despite maybe a few hiccups here or there in the track listing. The production here on this thing is really solid. The rapping here from Logic is some of the best that he's done in years. The lyrics on this thing are some of the best of his in years as well, and I really like how he takes various subjects and kind of ties them together under this bigger concept of it being, you know, like his last album, if you will. And I'm just really happy that not only is this record good, but also it seems like Logic's in a much happier place on this record than he was on Confessions of a Dangerous Mind. You know, not only because some of the lyrics on this record kind of, you know, hint at him being a lot happier, but it also seems like, you know, between his child and his family and some of the stuff that he's going to be doing on Twitch now, it just seems like he's in a bit of a happier place. You know, there's a lyric here on this thing where he's talking about whether or not his career in hip-hop has made him happier overall or if it's made him worse when it comes to his own mental health. And I feel like here on this project, you know, he's having one big last hurrah where he's just really happy with hip-hop before he wants to move on to other things and maybe be happier doing those other things. Will he eventually return to hip-hop someday? Who knows? He might very well do that in a few years' time. You know, like I said before, there's plenty of artists out there that do say that they're going to retire and then just a mere few years later come back with new material. And that could be the case for Logic. But if he does decide to do that, I'm actually quite open to it, honestly, especially after a project like this. I think if he's doing stuff that he's happy with, if he's doing stuff that he wants to make, and all of that stuff like he is here on this project, I think the quality of the material will be a lot better than projects like Confessions of a Dangerous Mind and Supermarket, where it kind of felt like that wasn't entirely the case for those records. But yeah, overall, I think this is a good record. It's worth checking out for hip-hop fans, for Logic fans who maybe haven't been keeping up with his work. I think this is a project still worth checking out, even if you really hated those last couple of releases. And yeah, overall, I guess best wishes to Logic with whatever he's going to be doing in the near future. I've covered quite a few records and mixtapes of his here on the channel, so yeah, I guess best wishes to him going forward. But yeah, that sums up my thoughts on this project. So everything I said here was just my own personal opinion. If you happen to disagree, that's perfectly fine. In fact, feel free to leave your own thoughts on this record in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, make sure you also leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more music-related content. Things like album reviews, countdown lists, discussion videos, things of that sort. Again, thank you guys for watching, and stay golden.